I'm at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology right now, where I'm going to have an interview with the most cited author of the decade. According to Google Scholar, his works have been cited over 200,000 times during the past decade. Tribune Media presents Program Insights, and my guest today will be Professor of Economics, Daron Acemoglu. Stay with us. Thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. I will start with a global question. It seems like the world is going crazy right now. People are predicting some global crisis, economic whatevers. Is it exaggeration, or we should really be wary of these kind of things? What's happening in the world right now, especially post-COVID? What's going on? Please explain.
Well, I don't know that I have the explanation, but two perspectives are useful. One is that indeed, we are dealing with more and more complex problems because we live in a more connected, globalized world that has a number of fault lines that are generating a lot of backlashes. So climate change, pandemics are all global problems, and democracy's decline is a backlash to a particular type of development process in which democratic norms have been strong, but at the same time under strain because of growing inequality, growing globalization, and so on. On the other hand, I think partly because of social media, partly because of the media, the traditional media's business model, exaggerating things has become very common. So we are attaching the label crisis to everything: mental health crisis, climate crisis, pandemic crisis, democracy crisis, economic crisis. So sometimes it's useful to gain people's attention, but whether we have really a polycrisis, all the crises happening for related reasons, or we just have the next phase of complex problems that we have to deal with, that remains unclear.
Okay, so either yes or no,
Either
it may
yes or
be.
no, yes.
And we have many films about that, which would deliver panic. What's going on in the world? About democracies, in almost all your books, you mention about the role of institutions in shaping the state policies and politics. And that's, of course, true. How can we deal with the states and countries that are very much into corruption, not democratic? How do institutions work in that case? What's the recipe?
Well, part of the reason why institutions, in my mind, are so important is because they have wide-ranging influences that go beyond just the democracy versus non-democracy binaries. So institutions matter, especially in countries that have weak institutions. So we have to sort of take that into account. And I think the issue is that corruption is a symptom of deeper institutional problems. And these deeper institutional problems are both becoming more important and more visible. At some level, if you go by the numbers, today the world is more democratic than it has ever been. But at the same time, aspirations related to democracy have grown. So dissatisfaction with democracy is also as strong as it has been. And part of the reason is because democratic countries have not been able to deal with inequality. They have not been able to deal with corruption. They've not been able to deal with the challenges of globalization. So I think the fact that people are still somewhat beholden to democratic norms is encouraging. But the fact that, especially among the young, many people are saying, well, democracy is not working so well, is a big alarm bell.
Can it ever happen that everywhere in the world we have only democratic states? Is it possible?
Well, we're definitely not going to get there anytime soon, nor do I view that as a likely outcome. So there are a bunch of theories I disagree with, which are which go either the name of modernization theories or some sort of end of history, like teleological theories, where somehow we always progress towards better outcomes, better institutions, albeit with some ups and downs. And if you believe in those, you might think, well, ultimately, we're all going to be governed by democracies. The main point of my book with James Robinson, The Narrow Corridor, was to argue that, not just democracy, not just sort of a constrained state, but also a despotic state and an extremely weak state are stable attractors. So you can end up with such outcomes and they're not going to reverse themselves. They're not going to create a tendency for suddenly sort of transition to better democratic governments. And today, with another decade between that book, well, less than a decade, but almost a decade between that book and my views now, I would say even when we look at democracies, there are many different types of democracies that can emerge, and there isn't a seamless process where the better forms of that democracy is going to kind of emerge. So India is a type of democracy. It's a majoritarian democracy without checks on the prime minister that actually has become more and more powerful. The US is a democracy with a huge amount of polarization. Sweden is a democracy, but there you see a lot of variety between these different types of democracies.
Different democracies, one of them are. And if we are speaking about democracies and states which are not very strong and not very rich, here some opponents of your books and your works would mention that the institutions like IMF and World Bank that function mostly in these types of countries, they are playing the game of benefiting the few. And it's basically not for a favor to these big institutions for all the states to become richer, better off. How would you speak about this?
Well, I mean, I would agree with that, but I don't think that contradicts my thesis. So the fact that IMF is controlled by the United States and supports policies that are in line with the US interests and financial interests doesn't mean that, democracy is the best system. And IMF, for other reasons, actually, I think is generally favorable to democracy, not always generally favorable. But the fact that IMF, for other reasons, sometimes supports democracy, neither detracts nor adds to democracy. I think we should evaluate democracy on its own characteristics. And I think those are how good are democracies in actually being responsive to people. Does democracy actually generate better ways for people to express themselves? I think the answer is clearly yes. Does democracy generate better economic outcomes on the whole, like, for example, economic growth? Well, that's a controversial topic, but my research says yes, generally quite strongly yes. Does democracy do better in terms of catering to the poor? Again, my research shows yes in terms of health, education, and a few other things, poverty alleviation, yes. Does democracy reduce inequality? Well, the evidence is more mixed because it does well for the poor. It doesn't do so well with other things. But on the whole, I think as a bundle, democracy, if it functions, is doing quite well. And those are the criteria with which you should judge democracy, not whether IMF supports it or not.
If we are speaking about developing countries and countries that are not that rich at the moment, they have a choice whether to go towards the rapid economic growth, which will make them heavily reliant and dependent on international sources and resources like the IMF and other countries. Like, in your opinion, and if we take maybe the example of Armenia as well, Armenia's economy, we try to grow, and we also sometimes have debt, sometimes have some resources from World Bank, from IMF, from wherever. Is this a good model? And from this point of view of politics and from the point of view of internal country, how good is it to rely on the funds from international entities, and how is it going to shape their politics in the future?
Well, I think if you already depend heavily on IMF funding, you haven't done very well. Because IMF funding becomes particularly relevant when you are in a crisis or semi-crisis. So I would say, there are many different types of growth, and there are many different thresholds. Some of them are hard, some of them are very, very hard. So getting to, say, where Ethiopia or Rwanda is, which is starting very poor, but with some sort of state capacity, without democratization, getting a little bit of growth, that's not that hard. Getting where, say, South Korea or Singapore is, that seems much harder. So China hasn't achieved that, for example. And many other countries actually start with an advantage and then squander that advantage. Argentina or Armenia are examples. I mean, Armenia, when it gained its independence, had a number of advantages relative to other previously socialist communist countries. Within the Soviet Union, it was the more heavily educated, was the more technical engineering, complex industry place. It had a more vibrant civil society, so it had a very smooth transition to democracy, but then it completely squandered all of these gains. So it shows that even the easier things are not that easy. But you are seeing, for example, that even starting from the level of dysfunction that India had, kickstarting growth is feasible. It takes work, and it often comes with lots of other sort of unpleasant things like greater inequality or pollution or other issues. But it is possible to kickstart growth, to make it into sustained growth. That's the really hard part.
Yeah. Why do countries, is it because of the leadership that they are not able to use even the resources that they have?
It's a combination of leadership and other institutional factors. If you are in a situation like Iran, for example, I wouldn't say like it's leadership in the sense that, you have leaders who are not good. The whole Iranian system right now is predicated on a very small fraction of the population. So the Revolutionary Guard, some clerics, some regime insiders exploiting the rest of the country. So in a situation like that, that small clique is going to be very against any type of change that will destabilize its command. And so that's why I think Iran has completely lagged behind its potential. In the case of Armenia too, I think I wouldn't say, there are many examples of important leadership mistakes over the last 30 years, but also it's an unequal country with its own elite that was not always supportive of, the best developmental policy.
If we speak about the recent technological developments, particularly the AI, I was watching one of your interviews to CNBC lately, where you mentioned that it's not such of a big deal that we speak of AI. It's not going to be to have the horrific effects that we think it will have. On the other hand, you also mentioned that AI is going to affect different countries with different levels of development in a different manner.
Well, I would say I would characterize or summarize my views a little different, meaning that I don't think AI is going to have the catastrophic effects of, suddenly destroying all jobs and creating joblessness. And it's not going to have the catastrophic effects of creating superintelligence and then driving humanity to extinction. But I do think AI can have pretty bad effects if we pursue the path of OpenAI and other big tech companies. AI will enrich a small fraction, and it will collect more and more data. It will impose more and more surveillance on people, and it will create more and more sidelining of workers and inequality coming from many different dimensions. So those are all costly things, and they will be more costly for the developing world as well, because they will impact the global division of labor. So I'm not, taking a sort of, everything's going to be fine type of attitude. I just point out that the some of the alarmist voices on AI are talking about the wrong targets.
Oh, okay. So it's not that a big deal as of now.
It's not that it's a big deal as of now. Its capabilities are exaggerated, but there are a lot of social harms that could follow, and will likely follow from AI unless we regulate it right.
Back to Armenia, as a political economist, and right now we have strong negotiations, let's say so, about the opening of Armenian-Turkish border. These rumors, negotiations have been there for a very long time. In your opinion, is it going to happen anytime soon? And what would the implications of that open border be?
I have no idea. I have no idea because, I think the Turkish position is rather complicated. There is some, historical animosity between Turkey and Armenia. But the more complex part is Turkey benefits a lot from its relations with Azerbaijan. And the question is, how much Turkey is the patron in that relationship so that it can sort of manage Azerbaijan while at the same time having better relations with Armenia, or how much is it beholden to Azerbaijan? And I don't know the answer to that. So I don't know how much freedom Erdogan has if he wants to sort of open the border with Armenia, and whether he actually wants to or not. Because in the past, he did spearhead some opening with Armenia, and then he reversed it himself. And today, Azerbaijan is much stronger and much more important for Turkey than then.
Yeah, of course. And we also, when we consider it economically, for a small state like Armenia, opening the border and promoting the free movement of goods and whatever is going to have a terrible...
Of course, it's very, very important. Yeah, absolutely. For Armenia, it's very important. For Turkey, it's not. So Turkey will not have a huge benefit from that. I mean, Armenia is a much smaller country. Turkey trades already a lot with that region. It's only one little small part of it. So it is already an unequal relationship between Armenia and Turkey. So in other words, Armenia needs the Turkish border. Turkey doesn't need the Armenian border.
On the other hand, some people argue that the moment this border opens, it is going to kill all the industry in Armenia, whatever we have, because it's small, and it's going to kill whatever small we have because of the goods that flow with the cheaper prices, with I don't know what kind of quality.
But that is a risk worth taking, because I think Armenia cannot survive but as an exporter.
Okay.
So Armenia doesn't have a large internal market. Its expertise is in products that can be supplied to the rest of the world. So trading with the rest of the world is essential for Armenia.
Okay. If we go back to 2018, we had this, I remember personally listening to this on TV, Prime Minister Pashinyan announced that he just spoke with Daron Acemoglu, who agreed to come to Armenia and help get the economy back to its feet. You never came to Armenia.
Well, because I never believed that I had the ability to do that. I mean, I am an outsider. I don't understand Armenian economy to the degree of detailed understanding. So I was very, very happy to talk to the Prime Minister, and I continued that conversation a couple more times. But I would not exaggerate the ability of any outside expert, least of all me, to actually have a transformative effect on an economy. I think at the end of the day, a country's economy depends on its own resources, and the experts who have the deepest knowledge are going to be those inside.
But your insights and your experience as a researcher, as a professor, as a person who has been there for a very long time, could it have been indispensable to the local experts and people who know the economy? I mean, teaming up with local people, maybe?
Perhaps, and I'm always open to having those conversations. And I have not been around for that long, but...
Well, I like I mentioned before the interview, I remember that I cited your works in my dissertation, and like it's really very... You have works that analyze some things, and then you see the real life impacts of these works. How do you feel personally when you see the impact of inequality on families and communities? And you could see this coming, you did this in your research. Is it a struggle for you personally?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, part of the reason why inequality and other outcomes related to economic development that are disruptive are so problematic is precisely because of their negative influences on families, on communities. And today, actually, the world economy is growing, but community relations are not what they used to be. And there are many, many parts of the United States, Europe, and I presume Armenia, where economic growth fruits are not being shared. So that is actually the tragedy of economic development in the 21st century.
You mentioned that you are not from inside of Armenia, but being outside of Armenia, not knowing very well the economy and whatever is going on there internally. Do you think you can tell me what can a potential 2-3 steps we can do in Armenia to somehow enhance the economy and somehow become better off?
I don't know that I can, beyond things that I think everybody knows. For instance, Armenia's real strength upon independence was its human capital, its educated workforce. And what has happened since then, the country has not kept that up, and some of its most educated people have left because of, economic instability, political instability, corruption. So reversing that brain drain is obviously going to be very important. Finding the right niche where Armenian human capital can be applied can be very important. So, for example, we mentioned AI. AI is already an active area, so far as I understand, in Armenia. And if you look at within the developing world, I think Armenia has as good human capital to devote to that area as any other country. But that's why I said export. The market for AI within Armenia is tiny. It's a tiny country. But if Armenian researchers, Armenian workers can be at the frontier of the tech sector and export some of the services and products, that could be very important.
Can the tech sector only support economic growth? I mean, can we rely heavily on tech sector?
Not just tech. I mean, I think if you do that, inequality will multiply just like in the US. So tech sector has to be one of the pillars, but not just the only pillar.
And all the other pillars have to be... Considering the fact that Armenia is a very sophisticated geographical area, what are other, not only the human capital, what should we as people, as Armenians do to get the best out of this? Because it's very sophisticated, region is like
complex,
very complex. And every day you wake up, you don't know what's going on. Not only with Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, but everywhere in Russia, Iran.
I have no... That's one of the things that, Armenia-Russia relations are so complex, so dangerous. That's why an outsider's perspective is, only so good. Imagine the kind of outcomes, the kind of path that we saw with Ukraine. If the same happens in Armenia, that's disastrous. So the Russian bear needs to be managed. And that, I think, is one of the challenges that every politician, every leading politician, prime minister or whatever foreign minister in Armenia, I think, grapples with.
And we are not so good at managing it at the moment.
Well, I think that bear is very difficult to manage in general.
Can a country have just one ally? Can we? No. We have
because, you see what, Armenia relied on Russia as its ally, and look at what happens. And
on the other hand, if you don't rely on Russia as an ally, you're waking up the bear.
Exactly. So.
Okay, let's go back to what's going on in the world. Given the rising skepticism towards globalization, what role do you think emerging technologies such as AI will play in reinforcing and dismantling the global economic order? Not just like workforce, etc. Just how the AI is going to affect the global economic order.
Well, it's a very good question, but I think, again, very difficult to know. I think AI is already deepening one aspect of globalization. So the globalization of culture, social media is now where youth across most of the 150 countries around the world are spending their time on. So that's a much more globalized culture than what we have seen before. But on the other hand, the race on AI, for example, between Europe and the US, between China and the US, is also a force towards deglobalization. So AI is complicating those aspects. On the other hand, some of the AI applications are going to change the international division of labor. How are they going to change that? That's also not determinate. For example, if AI goes down the path of automation, it could eliminate a lot of middle-skill jobs in India, in Armenia, in Indonesia. On the other hand, if AI becomes a much, much better tool for workers, for example, for translation or for getting better information, it can actually help some of the developing countries supply services to the rest of the world. So it's going to depend on the path of development of AI.
And can states manage the mal-usage, let's say so, of AI?
Well, I think that is a question. But the other cousin question or sister question to that is, can civil society manage the states using AI? AI requires resources. and states have more resources. So every one of the AI-related techs have been taken over by states as a surveillance mechanisms. Look at China, look at the US, look at Russia. So AI poses a real threat to civil society being stifled as well.
So it's not only about states, but the civil society as well. Because when you see, for example, let's say ChatGPT, you say, well, that's a good tool, let's do this and this. But there is also so many ways to use it on the harm, to harm people.
100%.
Not only ChatGPT, all the AI tools. And I mean, as a person, as a citizen, I'm wondering, how will my state control that so that me, my children, my, I don't know, parents never have the harms of the AI? And that's...
Good luck.
I remember when I was studying at UCL, and we would study public economic policy and analysis. We had this block which was called behavioral economics, and here we spoke mainly about the economic incentives. On the example of, let's say, cigarettes, if you tax cigarettes heavily, people are going to smoke less. If you do this, people are going to do that. How now, especially now, the economic incentives work? Do they work? I mean,
well, they do, but you can use incentives just like information for good or ill. So the Chinese Communist Party is using economic incentives to keep people in line. So, or you can use economic incentives to encourage entrepreneurship. So those are some of the questions. So this is why state-civil society relations matter greatly. And again, that's the theme of the Narrow Corridor book. You need a balance between state and civil society. Otherwise, controlling the state becomes harder and harder.
Of course. One question, there is a growing narrative that academics in elite institutions like MIT and others are somehow disconnected from the real world. Their work resembles only research, and they are not so connected to the people and the study. How do you ensure that your work remains relevant and beneficial to those outside of the academic and political elite? Well, how would you do that?
Well, I think it's a complex question, because the ivory tower aspect has both costs and benefits. The special place of some institutions like Harvard, Stanford, MIT is that they can do cutting edge science even ahead of applications. And that's enabled by the ivory tower. So if you turn these institutions into commercial incentives too strongly, they're not going to do that. They're not going to do the technologies that are going to be commercialized in 50 years. On the other hand, if you are too much of an ivory tower, then you lose touch with society. I think the bigger problem, in my opinion, in the United States is that it's not the science, but the overall culture of these institutions that has lost touch with society. These institutions' students are so privileged and so different from regular people that there is a disconnect between elite institutions and the rest of society. And I don't think it is a surprise that, for example, Republican-leaning voters or politicians are feeling more and more animosity towards elite institutions, because there is this chasm between the kinds of people who vote Republican and what goes on in these elite institutions.
Given the scope and the gravity of the issues that you study, have you ever felt overwhelmed, disheartened with with how slow everything is developing, how your findings are reflecting the real world?
Well, I mean, I feel overwhelmed in the fact that, not because my findings do or do not percolate the reality, but just we are living through very complex times where very major challenges. The fact that democracy is under threat or inequality has increased so much. Those are, I think, overwhelming things in some sense.
What can we do to slow down the...
I don't have perfect solutions. I mean, I think, again, my interest always is more on the understanding rather than the direct policy. I sometimes draw out the policy implications of my work, but what motivates me more is to understand the changes that are happening.
As you reflect on your career, are there any moments or decisions that stand out as particularly meaningful to you?
I think as I reflect on my career, I look back and I say how lucky I have been that I had the freedom to study the kinds of things that motivate me and I find exciting.
Okay, speaking back about Armenia a little bit more, since you know my audience is mostly in Armenia, I would really like to see your vision of where the country is going, taking into account what is happening right now, and not giving any advices, any implication, just a few notes on vision, where the country is going and what we can do to make it go in a better direction.
Well, look, again, I'm simplifying it greatly. But within the Soviet Union's dysfunctional economy, Armenia was the high-tech engineering and high human capital hub. In some sense, the hope would have been, perhaps should have been, that Armenia would be a democratic, high-tech, high human capital hub for the developing world, for the emerging world. It hasn't achieved that. That's a failure. But I think it's not too late.
To get back whatever we had. And looking at the world right now, my last question, I promise, what's going to happen with us in 5-10 years?
I think it's all to play for. The future is not written. It's going to depend on what happens with technology, with AI. It's going to depend on what happens with inequality. If the global tech companies continue to become more and more dominant, that's not good for any country. It's going to depend on democracy and globalization. It's going to depend on US-China relations. Again, there is a very bad scenario there where tensions between US and China turn into something like a Cold War or even a hot war, or they can be managed. So all of these things are going to be very important. And the problem for countries like Armenia, Turkey, is that these are events outside of their control. Armenia has some very important decisions for itself. Turkey has some very important decisions for itself, but it cannot control where technology will go right now. It cannot control what will happen between China and the US. It cannot control whether democracy in the US collapses and Donald Trump comes to power. So all of these things will have first-order effects on Armenia, on Turkey, on Uzbekistan, on Indonesia, but it's outside of their control. So that's part of the challenge of the age.
Big countries decide the fate of smaller ones.
And these tensions between big countries will have implications.
Thank you so much for the great interview.
Thank you.
I really hope to have a chance for another interview anytime soon.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you.